Sometimes I think we read the Bible like it's a collection of incredible things that God used to do. We read about Moses standing at the edges of the Red Sea and God making a way where there wasn't one. We read about David walking onto that battlefield with a sling and a few stones while everybody else was terrified of the giant. We read about Esther risking everything because an entire generation needed somebody willing to say, "If I perish, I perish." We read about Joseph going from a pit to slavery to a prison to a palace and realize that what looked like years of setbacks were actually pages in a story that God was still writing. We read about Peter stepping out of that boat, Paul and Silas singing in a prison, 3 Hebrew boys walking through a fire, a little boy helping Jesus by handing him his lunch and watching him feed thousands with it. And somewhere along the way, we started talking about these stories like the God who wrote them retired when the last page of the Bible was finished. He didn't. The same God is still writing stories today. He's still taking the overlooked and he's using them. He is still calling people who don't feel qualified. He is still opening doors that nobody thought could open. He's still bringing purpose out of people's pain. He's still taking things that the enemy meant for destruction, and he's weaving them together into testimonies that will help somebody else survive. And just maybe that's why your story doesn't look like everybody else's. Maybe you've been looking at your life wondering why there have been so many strange chapters. Why did that door close? Why you had to walk through that valley? Why you survived something that should have destroyed you? Why God allowed you to experience things that you never would have chosen for yourself? But you see, Joseph, he couldn't see Egypt from the pit. David, he couldn't see the throne while he was tending sheep. Esther, she couldn't see the deliverance of her people when she was an orphan little girl. See, they were living the pages before they ever understood the whole story. So are you. You see, we have got to stop believing that the greatest stories that God ever wrote are behind us. There are still testimonies being written right now, right at this very moment. There are still Red Sea moments. There are still giants falling. There are still prison doors opening. There are still people walking through fires and coming out without the smell of smoke. And there are still Esthers discovering that everything that they have lived through has positioned them for a moment that they couldn't see coming. For such a time as this. Friend, you weren't accidentally born in this generation. You weren't accidentally placed in this season. You aren't here just to read about what God did through somebody else. You are living in the days somebody else may one day hear about. And your obedience matters. Your yes matters. Your testimony matters. Your story, it matters because it's being written by a master author. The same God that was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is still the same God today. The God of Moses is still God. The God of David is still God. The God of Esther is still God. The God of Peter and Paul, yeah, he's still God. And he's still writing. So don't give up because you're in a chapter that doesn't make sense right now. You see, I've walked through many chapters that didn't make sense. And only recently have they started making sense. See, your story isn't over. You were created for such a time as this. And who knows what God is writing through your life right now that somebody else will need to hear someday. And that is exactly why I believe that our stories need to be told. Because after all, they're not really our stories. They're His. If you have an amazing story of God's faithfulness, I would love to hear it. Maybe God carried you through something that you never thought you would survive. Maybe He restored what looked impossible to restore. Maybe He met you in grief, addiction, loss, disability, homelessness, abuse, church hurt, failure, or even a season when you thought you had absolutely nothing left. Maybe your story doesn't look dramatic, but you can look back and say, God was faithful. I want to hear that story. I'd love to have you as a guest on the Radically Rooted podcast and give you a place to share what God has done in your life. You don't have to be a preacher. You don't have to be an author. You don't have to have a platform or thousands of followers. You just need a story of a faithful God. Because somewhere out there, there's a person sitting somewhere in the middle of the chapter that you've already survived. And maybe, just maybe, hearing your story will remind them that the same God who brought you through is still writing their story too. If that's you, send me a message. I'd love to have you on the show. If you don't share it with me, share it somewhere, because there are people out there that need to hear what God has done in your life. Let's tell the world that the God of the Bible is still writing amazing, beautiful stories today. Be blessed, be encouraged, and I'll see you next time.